All right, go ahead.
Hi there. My name is Matthew Fox, and I'm on Your Superior Self.
I can't tell you, Mr. Fox, how incredibly excited I am to speak with you today because I've read your book, Cosmic Christ, and I'm reading your newest book, which is Essential Writings on Creation Spirituality, which I'm very fascinated by. But first, I just want to say thank you for taking the time. I know you're a busy guy. It really is a pleasure to have you here tonight.
Well, I'm glad to be with you, and I'm glad you have a program like this where people can think together and ask questions that matter.
So I'm very curious about your journey, right? So you, I Googled you, and like you're ranked on like world's most spiritual man or something like that. And so I want to know, like, how do you go from that, right, at a young age? You were a priest too. So how do you go from that to being ranked as one of the most spiritual men in the world? Like, where did your story start?
Well, I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm a Midwesterner. My father was was a football coach at the University of Wisconsin. And I'm one of 7 children. I was in the middle and grew up Catholic. And I went to public high school, and I had great debates with my friends who were Jewish or Protestant or agnostic. So I'd go to my parish priest, a Dominican, and he would give me ammunition like G.K. Chesterton or Thomas Aquinas to read and stuff. And I was interested in that intellectual side to religion and to my tradition. And I had these experiences. Like when I was 12, I got polio, and I lost my legs, and they couldn't tell me if I'd ever walk again. And my older brothers were all state football and that stuff. My father was a football guy. And so it was kind of a shock. And but after about a year or so, I got my legs back. And I said to the universe, I'll never take my legs for granted again. So I learned a deep lesson when I was 12 about not taking for granted. And I did end up playing plenty of sports, but with more detachment, I think, than my brothers and father did. So while I was sick in the hospital for many months, a Dominican brother would visit me, and he was very contemplative and very quiet, kind of the opposite of my father. And he ended up being a Trappist monk. And I saw, he kind of showed me another way of being a man. You know, you don't have to be a football player to be a man. And so I read Tolstoy's War and Peace when I was like 16, and it blew I told a friend, it blew my soul wide open. I know what happened to me. Today, I would say it was a mystical experience, but I didn't have the language. But I said I wanted to explore what happened to me. And that drew me into the Dominicans, to explore that side of the self that is spiritual and that is contemplative. And of course, I read some Thomas Merton too, and the Catholic monk. And in fact, years later, I corresponded with him, asked him where to go to study spirituality. He said, go to the Institut Catholique in Paris. So the Dominicans let me go there to study spirituality. And I was blessed to do that. So I really enjoyed the Dominicans, and we got along fine for like 34 years until the Pope silenced me for a year, and then he expelled me from the order after 34 years. And the objections to my work was that I was, quote, this is the language, I'm a feminist theologian. Well, I didn't know it was a heresy to be a feminist theologian. I still don't know that. Secondly, I call God Mother. Well, all kinds of medieval mystics call God Mother. In fact, this woman over my shoulder, Juliana Norwich, a wonderful, wonderful saint, she developed God as mother more than anyone up to the late 20th century. 700 years before today, she was a feminist, developing not only God as mother, but Christ as mother and so forth. So the divine feminine, bringing that in, I had a strong mother and a strong father. My father was Scorpio and my mother was Taurus, so they didn't give a lot of ground to each other. But you know, and I had 3 sisters as well as 3 brothers. So, you know, I grew up knowing to respect women and all that, and that there was much to say as us boys had to say. And they're also just as good as athletes as we were too, I'll say that. But anyway, that's a little of my story. And I was blessed to have a good education with the Dominicans and then in Paris. And my mentor there, Père Chanou, was a 75-year-old French Dominican who'd been silenced by Pope Pius XII for 12 years, forbidden to publish in the 40s and 50s, because he worked with the unions in France. And many of the unions were Marxist after the war. And that kind of freaked out the Vatican a little. And but in the Second Vatican Council, he was very important. He wrote the most important document of church in the modern world. He wrote the first draft of it. And he was my mentor in Paris. And he's the one who named the creation spiritual tradition for me. And it made so much sense. He said there are these two traditions in Christianity. One begins with the fall, and it's all about redemption, but the other begins with creation. And it's about the artist, and it's about science, because you go to science to know what creation's about, and it's about justice. And that really turned me on. I was studying with him in 1968 when the students in France brought de Gaulle's government down, but they were rioting. We were rioting everywhere, all over the world at the time, in Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, and Berkeley too, and all that. But that was really a moment for me when he named those traditions. And I just realized, well, creation spirituality is the way to go for our generation. And it's about ecology, obviously. And it's about getting beyond the anthropocentrism, what Pope Francis calls the narcissism of our species. Now, Pope Francis, wrote this great encyclical on the environment called Laudato Si. It's really, I have a friend who's a scientist, and he says it's far and away the best document ever written by the Vatican on science. And he actually brings in the man who wrote that for him. Essentially 80% of it was a student of mine who went through my master's program in creation spirituality. So I lived through two popes, JP2 and Benedict XVI, who called my work, quote, dangerous and deviant, unquote. Now a third pope, I've lived long enough to see a third pope plagiarize my work, or at least borrow it for his encyclical. So I feel pretty good about that I've lived a big enough circle that I've seen it all.
Well, when you get kicked out of priesthood, I guess that's what it's called, are you still allowed to take Eucharist?
Well, actually, what happened is they kicked me out of the Dominicans after 34 years, not out of the church.
Okay.
But then I met some young Anglicans who were reinventing the Mass, the liturgy in Sheffield, England, using rave, dance, DJ, VJ, rap, all these new art forms. And make a long story short, I was really impressed with what they're doing. I visited them and everything. I said, how can I help? They said, well, if you became an Anglican priest, you could run interference because you get what we're doing. We're already using your cosmic Christ theology. And so I prayed about that, thought about it. I said, well, the Pope fired me. He's telling me he doesn't need me. So I went to the Episcopal bishop in San Francisco and said, here's the deal. I want to become an Episcopalian, but only for one reason, to work with young people to reinvent forms of worship, because I think liturgy is really important. But let's bring today's language into it, today's art forms. And he said, go for it. We're not doing anything for young people. He said, I'll give you a green light on that one. So I've been doing that for the last 25 years. I was a Catholic priest for about 25 years, and I've been an Episcopal priest for about 25 years. But we put on about 120 of these cosmic masses, we call them the cosmic mass, all over North America. And it's about dancing your prayer more than turning pages in a book. And it works. It draws a lot of people. We did one at the World Parliament of Religion in Toronto a couple of years ago, just before COVID hit. And 500 people showed up, including Buddhist monks and robes, and Catholics and Jews and Protestants and all kinds of people. And it was a big hit. People said it was the most important event of the whole 12-day conference. One woman said, she was in her 40s, said, this is the most powerful religious experience I've ever had. And those are the kind of responses we've had whenever we've done it. So I love the liturgy, but I love it enough to change it, in the sense to bring contemporary art forms into it. It's like in the 12th century when they invented Gothic cathedrals and all this light and beauty that came in, and then this tremendous stained glass. That's what, today's multimedia do, like fractals and stuff. Like we had a mass on Hildegard of Bingen, a saint, recently made a saint. And she's painted a lot of her visions. And we took these marvelous paintings, and then this VJ, turned it into fractals. And so there we were dancing in the presence of Hildegard's teachings of 800 years ago. And it was just so beautiful and stunning. So it really works. And I have young people, operating it now. I'm kind of the elder in the background, but definitely we do the Eucharist, but it's open. We have Buddhists and we have atheists. Here's a cute story. I mean, a funny story. We did it for 1,000 people at the Sounds True conference in Colorado. And afterwards, and I asked people when we started what traditions, all the traditions were there. Afterwards, a woman comes up to me. She says, I'm an atheist. I'm such a fierce atheist that when I'm walking down the street and there's a church, I cross the street to go around the church, get by the church. I said, yeah, that's pretty fierce. Well, she said, something happened to me tonight. She pointed to her chest. She said, when we did that grieving ceremony, because I always have a grieving experience, I think that's so important today. We're all grieving. And we need to grieve more consciously. So anyway, when we did the grievings, it was something happened inside of me, and she hit her chest like this. And she said, by the time communion came along, I had to have some. I was hungry for it. She said, my whole life has changed today. So that's not the first time we've had atheists kind of have a mystical experience in a mass. So that's part of the fun of all this. It's full of surprises.
It's so interesting. You talk about some of the mystical experiences that you've had over the years with your chanting or prayer, meditation. What has been the most powerful one thus far?
Well, I went through a period of my training as a Dominican. We had a lot of mystical experiences. I just loved the training. There was meditation time. There was the mass every day. There was study, and I love to study. And Dominicans teach you that studying is a form of spiritual practice. If you bring your heart to it, and you're not in there just to get grades or something else. And so reading the mystics and reading these great thinkers of our past, like Thomas Aquinas, of course, he was a Dominican. This got me so high, sometimes I could hardly stand it. So my confessor said at one point, well, he said, you should consider becoming a hermit. I said, a hermit? I like people. I want to teach someday. I like sports. No, he said, think about becoming a hermit. So I thought about it seriously, and make a long story short, I went to a hermitage one summer, way out in the Vancouver Island. And it's a beautiful ride out there. I'd never been west, and it was a train ride, to the West Coast. That was great in itself. But I was there for several weeks, and it was a colony, a small colony of hermits, men, run by a Benedictine abbot from Belgium, actually. But we ended up agreeing that I don't have to be a hermit. But I drew so much energy from that. In a way, I left the priesthood before I became a priest, because my provincial didn't like the idea of trying out the hermits. He said, that's a crazy thing to do. And I said, well, I want to do it anyway. Well, he said, you may never get ordained. That's okay. I want to do it anyway. So I left the priesthood before I became a priest. I think maybe a little freer priest when that came around. But, I've had my share of experiences. At one time, I'll tell you one experience I had. I was lecturing to about 2,000 people in a big hotel in Washington, D.C. And it was a gathering Catholic educators. And I just published my book on compassion, spirituality and compassion. And at one point in the middle of my talk, I was up on the ceiling. There was a great big chandelier on the ceiling. I was on the ceiling watching myself talk. And that was interesting. It was a very gentle experience. I was up there watching myself talk. And then I gently kind of re-entered my body and all that. And afterwards, an awful lot of people said it was a special talk. They just felt a special energy in the room and all this stuff. So that's one experience I had.
What do you experience anything like as far as like your awareness is disconnected from your body. But there are moments of pure nothingness, right? Like some people describe that. Is that something similar to that?
I've had experiences of nothingness, my own nothingness and so forth. But that was different from that experience. That experience was very light-filled and very gentle, but also unusual. I mean, watching the crowd and watching myself talk away. But the experience of nothingness, I'm so glad you brought that up. That's very important. And again, this is part of the mystical journey, what the mystics call the via negativa. And the realization that Meister Eckhart, my favorite mystic, who was a Dominican and was condemned a week after he died by a very corrupt pope in Avignon. Eckhart talks about how isness is God, and our experience, and that's my whole theology, that our experience of awe and wonder, joy and so forth, that's the via positiva of the mystic. And that's the experience of God in our lives. But also the via negative experience of the darkness. Meister Eckhart says God is super essential darkness who has no name and will never be given a name. And that's a powerful dimension to divinity too. Then the third dimension of divinity is creativity. The divinity is always creating. The universe is always being created. And of course, science is very much on board with that now, that the universe is constantly expanding. And then the fourth experience is justice and compassion. Now, to experience one's own nothingness is really an important step in our spiritual awareness and in growing up. And I remember when it happened to me on several occasions when I was studying as a Dominican, being trained as a Dominican, I shared it with a friend of mine who was a psychologist who was in my class, but he was older than the rest of us, and he was a psychologist. And he really encouraged me. He said, that's nothing to run from. And I wrote in my journal that I wanted to kind of build my spirituality on that experience, because I think it gives you a freedom to know that you're not in charge, and it opens you up to what comes next, to the Spirit. The Spirit is always trying to work with us to co-create, and I heard you use that word earlier. And that's a deep part of the spiritual spirit, but we have to be emptied. Like Buddhists talk about mindfulness, but that presumes mind emptiness too, that we do have to be emptied, and we can choose to be emptied through meditation, for example, but also suffering empties us. We're no longer in charge when we're suffering. And like today, I would say what's happening in the world today is that our species is in a collective dark night of the soul. I call it the dark night of our species, because even before the Ukraine war, we didn't know how, we do not know. We're facing our extinction. And, this is real. We do not know how climate change is going to end, how we are going to put an end or slow down climate change. And if we don't, we're in deep trouble. As the scientists say, we have 7 years left to change our ways. This is a spiritual crisis for all of us. And it doesn't matter if you're Buddhist or Christian or Jewish or Muslim or atheist. We're in this together. There's only one earth. So we're in a very special moment. The mystics say the dark night of the soul, it's hard, but it's valuable. We learn things in the dark night that we don't learn in the light. And one of the things we learn is wisdom, not just knowledge, but wisdom. And we also learn compassion. And as Eckhart says, compassion begins at home with your own body and your own soul. So we do have to take compassion on ourselves and realize that the emptyings we go through in life, it could be anything from disease and sickness to divorce or losing someone we love. All that has a profound meaning. And of course, that's really the archetypal meaning of the cross for Christians. And of course, the Buddhists say that all beings suffer. So suffering is one of the avenues of the via negativa, you see, that it opens us up. But the experience of nothingness is not necessarily a negative experience. It's a realization that while we are all God connected, we are also from nothing. Eckhart says the painting on a wall depends on the wall. So our existence, our isness depends on God, depends on divinity. Mm-hmm. And that's what the experience of nothingness reveals to us, that the things are impermanent, as the Buddhists say, and that includes us. But it's not something to panic about. It's just it's getting a fuller picture of what life is like. That sure. We're on this earth temporarily, and why not make the most of it? And it's like what I said when I was a kid, I got my legs back. I'm not going to take it for granted. Why take our time on earth for granted? Why take our breath for granted? If you've been present for your baby to be born, your child, that first breath is sacred, and it is. And it's been present when someone dies, that last breath is sacred. But think of all the breaths in between and how easy it is to take those breaths for granted. And that's unwise. And the word for breath, is the same as the word for spirit in the scriptures. And around the world, really, most traditions identify breath and spirit. So the spirit's invisible and breath is invisible, but hey, they both matter.
Sure. Well, I guess my question to you, which is probably one of the harder questions to answer, I mean, ultimately, how do we get people to become more aware to that, right? How do we get people to become more conscious to the fact that we are on a path to extinction, right? Like, this isn't the first time that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about the previous extinctions that the earth has gone through. This is just one of them. But how do we really wake up people to that fact, or that path that we're going down, right? Like, is it the four paths? Is it reducing our addiction to technology to kind of pull out of that consciousness, that distraction, and reconnect with Mother Earth and to that divine feminine that you talk about?
Well, it's all those things. I think it's also realizing how powerful our capacity for denial is. I was lecturing a few years ago in Florida, and it was at a conference on ecology. And it was in northern Florida. We're getting northern Florida. And at that time, the governor of Florida, who's now a senator, was saying that anyone who uses the word climate change in any government literature or letters, correspondence, will lose his job. You can't use the word climate change. And here we were in a state. I visited South Miami that visit, and there was 4 inches of water on the street, on the sidewalks. And here's a governor of that state. The state is sinking, literally. And a governor of the state say you can't use those words. And he's not only getting away with it, he's getting elected as governor, then he's getting elected as senator. Now the same guy is head of the Republican Senate committee for all the senators running. So the power of denial is one of the biggest problems, because we can't underestimate. Meister Eckhart, the great mystic, says God is the denial of denial. And I really like that. Why didn't he just say God isn't denial? But no, God is the denial of denial. In other words, what he's saying, I think, is that if we're in denial as a group, as a people, as a society, or as a political party, whatever, divinity isn't anywhere to be seen, because denial is a refusal to face the truth. And of course, now here in Northern California, we've got these wildfires. We used to have wildfires 1 month a year. Now they're pick your month, 12 months a year. And of course, in the Southeast, you've got these hurricanes, much fiercer, much more frequent, etc. And of course, we've got the drought here in California. I mean, and I just read something yesterday, how you can see the drought in California from the sky now, from satellites up there, and everything. It's visible. And this is just America, but it's all happening everywhere. The increase of drought. I was at the 150 scientists for a week on an island a few years ago, and the theme was climate change. And they said, well, what's going to happen is the wet places are going to get wetter and more storms and more floods, and the dry places are going to get drier. And just yesterday, there's an article about what's going on in India right now as we speak, 120 degrees temperature. And, you know, they don't have much air condition or anything like that in India. And I mean, it's absolutely fierce. And it's going to be like that. We're not going backwards. It's going to get worse. So it's about survival. It's whether we love ourselves. Now, the divine feminine you bring up is so important because Adrienne Rich, who I love, her poetry, I think is really powerful. And she's a feminist in a real healthy way. She also has 2 sons, grown sons. But she said that patriarchy brings with it fatalistic self-hatred. Fatalistic self-hatred. So I look around at deniers of climate change and people who want to do anything but do something about climate change. And I say, you know, why do they hate themselves so much? Fatalistic self-hatred. And that Putin, he's involved in fatalistic self-hatred. How can you be making war, which is live on everyone's television set for the first time in history, invading another country? It has to be fatalistic self-hatred. So I think that goes with patriarchy. And patriarchy, I don't mean men. Patriarchy is a philosophy of how we should put our reptilian brain forward. And the reptilian brain is about win-lose. And that philosophy has taken over a lot of mindsets in our culture, not just that of some men, but of women as well. And we internalize it. So we've got to kind of do better in gender balance in terms of our own awareness. And Mother's Day is coming up now. And realize that the energy of the mother, which is also within men, it's our own creativity as well, and take care of our projects. But that capacity is a capacity of compassion. And that's how Julia Norwich, who's over my shoulder, talks about it, that motherhood is primarily about compassion. Well, that's what healthy religion's about too. That's the Dalai Lama says, we can do it with all religion, we can do away with it, but we can't do away with compassion. Compassion is my religion. Well, that's Jesus in Luke 6, be you compassionate, creator in heaven is compassion. In the Quran, by far the most frequent adjective for Allah is Allah, the compassionate one. So teaching compassion is what healthy religion is about. And that is bringing in the divine feminine to balance a strong and healthy masculine, not a patriarchal version of masculine, but a healthy version. I wrote a book on recovering the sacred masculine. I have 10 archetypes like Father Sky, Green Man, Blue Man, Hunter-Gatherer, Spiritual Warrior, all these wonderful archetypes, very ancient for what a real man is about. And even the word virtue. Virtue comes from the word for man, it's manliness. That's the traditional teaching of virtue. This is healthy manliness, where you develop capacity of courage and of standing up for justice and all the things we like to talk about for our heroes, like Dr. King or Gandhi or Mandela or someone else who stood up and counted themselves, John Lewis. That's manliness. That's healthy masculinity. Being number one is not manliness. Being the richest one on the block is not manliness. That's an ego problem. That's not adulthood. And so we have to find these ways of honoring and bringing out the divine feminine in men and women, and the healthy masculinity in men and women. And our whole culture has to change in that regard. For example, education. We're so busy pronouncing on knowledge that we forget there's such a thing as wisdom. Of course, wisdom is feminine. In the Bible, she's feminine. And of course, Mary in the Catholic tradition stands for the divine feminine. And of course, in the East too, over my shoulder, Kuan Yin, she's wisdom in the East, and she's feminine. She's feminine all around the world. So she's been banished from school. She's been banished from academia. That means from lawyers in the law profession. They don't get wisdom. They just get knowledge. And you go through all our professions, and it explains why we're in the trouble we're in today, because we're not feeling the suffering of Mother Earth, who's being crucified on a regular basis, and time's running out for us.
Sure.
Biologist a few years ago said, we're the first species in 4.5 billion years on the planet that can choose not to go extinct. First species that can choose not to go extinct. But he said, we haven't made that choice yet. There we are, facing our extinction.
So you talked about having more compassion. You talked a lot about our professional lives, right? But you talk about in this book how we need to change the way that we do our work in our everyday lives, even our professional lives. How do we change that? How do we become more passionate in our work? How do we rework work?
Well, I think the first thing is what the mystics teach, East and West. Aquinas says, the Tao Te Ching says, in work, do what you enjoy. In work, do what you enjoy. And I think that's really foundational, primal. And Aquinas says the same thing. He says that the joy is part of all good work. So finding the joy in work and asking the question, what joy do I receive from my work, and what joy do others receive from my work? I think it's a really important question. And I wrote a book on the reinvention of work. And when I got responses to it, a lot of people said that one question that I was raising changed their attitude toward the work. A number of people quit their jobs because of that question. And they found a work that brought more joy to them and to others. And then they were happy at work. So, I think that our work is where we leave our biggest footprint. Of course, also in parenting. But those two things, work and parenting, that's the gift we're leaving behind. And why wouldn't we want joy to accompany it? Mm-hmm. And when you bring up the subject of joy, you move from ego to community, because joy is not an isolated thing. When people are joyful, they want to share. And that's creating community, whether it be a family situation or a city or a country and so forth. So I think we have to continually feed the joy in our work and the beauty of life, that we have to meditate on the gift that this earth is, and what a unique tiny planet it is in the midst of this vast universe. But it's the only one that has giraffes and elephants and whales and rainforests and dogs and cats. And hey, why don't we enjoy it while we're here and make the sacrifices to preserve it? Thomas Aquinas has the most brilliant statement on salvation, this word salvation. He says, the first and primary meaning of salvation is to preserve things in the good. That's how he defines salvation. He doesn't mention staying out of hell or clawing your way to heaven. The first and primary meaning of salvation is to preserve things in the good. Isn't that a perfect definition of our task in this time of ecological climate change and crisis? Are we here? Are we committed to preserving things in the good at our work, whatever work we do, in our citizenship, in the people we elect for office, or if we choose to run for office, etc.? Is that what we're about? Preserving the good for future generations? What a noble vocation that is. And so I think we have to ask these kind of questions. And I think many people today, especially young people, are primed to ask and answer these questions, because they're not hiding. They're not in denial about climate change. They're asking serious questions about, do we dare to bring children into this world, given these circumstances? I mean, I hear that all the time from 20-year-olds and young 30-year-olds. And it's a serious question. And so now there are ways to stop climate change. I was at a conference at Sierra Club this past year, well, a couple of years, just before COVID. They asked me to speak on the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si, but also they had two scientists, and one of them was with Intel, and then he quit Intel to devote his whole life to climate change. And he comes from India. And he said this, he said, I'm an engineer, so listen to what I'm telling you, because I've done the numbers, I've crunched the numbers, he said. He had screen and projection pictures made, but the essence was this. He said, if everyone on the earth became vegan and took all the land that we're using for livestock to feed our meat habits and turned it into trees, which is what it once was, we would not only stop climate change in 10 years, we would turn it back in 10 years. Now, I don't think we can all be vegan, but there are degrees of vegan. First of all, young people should hear about that because they can choose to be vegan. But I think it's harder for us older people to change habits entirely. But we can all, there's a spectrum here. Many people can be vegetarian. And then people who do need meat or feel they do can eat less of it. So there's a spectrum, a degree of this. But the point is that is an arrow in our quiver of taking on climate change that no one ever mentions. They always talk about technology and new gadgets and new this and new that. Fine, let's go for the technology. But let's also take a look at our diets. And if it costs us something, if we're in love with beef or something or chicken or something, well, sacrifice is part of caring for your children, isn't it? And it's part of preserving the earth. So, asking for a little sacrifice, fasting is not a bad thing. It's good for the body and it's good for the soul. And in this case, it's good for the future community. Sure. So I think, those kind of questions are worth thinking about too, that there are ways out of this morass. But like you say, we have to wake one another up. We can't wait for 7 years and do nothing. We have to be active.
I think the key there is like the inner work, right? I think once everyone starts to find out more about or dial up the curiosity about what we truly are as far as like conscious and awareness or spiritual beings, and they travel inward, I think the more they connect with that essence, the more that all of the other stuff falls away, right? I find it true for myself where, I was a materialistic guy. I was very much into, a lot of the socioeconomic, topics that everyone's into now, where as I develop my spirituality more so, the more that I find all of that external materialistic things to fall away, right? Like my diet has totally changed. Like I'll drink black coffee. I try not to eat too many sweets. I don't like sugar because my body, I feel the effects immediately after having sugar. My meditations are stronger when I'm on a healthier diet. I am a meat guy. However, that's starting to fall to the wayside more because I find myself eating chicken and then I'm starting to feel tingles from probably all the chemicals they inject and steroids that they inject in the chicken. Steak, same thing, right? Like the more that I can purify my diet, the deeper that I have these experiences that you have talked about in meditation and in chanting, and which drives my passion to connect more. So I think going back to the reworking topic of everyone's professional lives, if companies like started investing more in the inner work for people and their employees, I think naturally what people would do is start wanting better lifestyles for themselves. I think they'll start connecting with that spirit that we are, that energy. They'll start having these mystical experiences more so in different depths, and they'll become more curious and they'll want to do these things for themselves as opposed to wanting to do something for like New Year's resolution or I need to lose 10 pounds because this and that. They'll start wanting to connect more with that spiritual side of themselves, and all of these other things will just start falling away and they'll start realizing who they truly are. And I don't know. Those are my thoughts. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think those are great thoughts. As far as my diet goes, I read Diet for a New America like 25 years ago when it came out, and I gave up beef because of that book 25 years ago, because it talked about how much land and water and wheat and so forth it takes to grow beef, a pound of beef. And so I quit, but I still eat chicken or fish and so forth. But and I haven't missed beef in the last 25 years. So it wasn't that difficult. I had enjoyed it up to then, or thought I had, but I think it's also been good for my body that I'm not eating red meat like that. And I'm healthier than a lot of other people I know at my age of 81. So knock on wood, I've been blessed in that regard. But I do think that maybe part of it is that I gave up beef thanks to that book. You know, that book was written by John Robbins of the Robin ice cream clan, and he gave up a big inheritance to go that way, and chose, and I got to know him. He lived here in the Bay Area, and it's an interesting story. And he was a young man, and I mean, he could have been super rich, but he gave up not only ice cream and sugar, but the whole corporation and all that. So I think that's quite impressive too, you know, that to made that choice. And that's when he studied more about how diet works and all, and wrote that book. So it involves us. For him, it was a financial sacrifice as well as a change of diet, you know. But I like how you talk about how meditation is important to you, and there are these lessons you learn there that are very valuable. And again, to me, that relates to the word virtue, which I think we've misunderstood in the West. You know, we think it's something about being goody-goody or something. But again, I go back to its origin. And Hildegard of Bingen, this amazing Renaissance woman of the 12th century, who was just canonized a saint 10 years ago, made a doctor of the church, and who was a feminist, by the way. She's a Trojan horse in the Vatican because she was a feminist, and Pope Benedict declared her a doctor of the church. That's a big deal. There are only a few other women who are doctors of the church, and this is as feminist has rolled into St. Peter's Square. But anyway, she writes a lot of letters, and she talks about virtue as being manliness, get strong. She writes bishops and abbots and emperors and popes and tells them to man up and to pay attention to justice, that this is virtue, this is strength. She wrote the Pope and said, you're surrounded by evil men who cackle at night like hens. She's talking about the Curia. And she was so funny. I mean, she was so direct with everybody. She told the emperor that he should grow up. He was acting like a baby. And Emperor Barbarossa, and she met him once in person too. But anyway, again, it's part of real healthy masculinity to be able to undergo the kind of things you're talking about, the emptying and the silencing of the mind. It's part of the Via Negativa. Meister Eckhart says nothing in all creation is so like God as silence. So that emptying and you know, fasting or vegetarianism or something, abstinence, that helps you to develop that inner light and lightness that helps you to you know, be a more joyful person and a more agile person. I do think that the future is going to require of all of us, certainly the young people, much more resilience and creativity and agility, because you know, life is not going to get easier for people with climate change happening. And of course, we're seeing now this raucous version of politics where you know, it's just off the charts in terms of anger and hostility and hatred. Of course, we've had this for years with hate radio, with Rush Limbaugh and all his imitators, and now we have hate television and we have hate politics. So it shouldn't be a real big surprise, but it can be overwhelming. So we all have to find that center where we can be ourselves, be our true selves, and find an inner peace so that we can project that into our work, as you say. Sure. And what you said about companies themselves encouraging people to meditate and so forth. Yes, I think that's very real. And I've seen studies that show you get more out of your workers when you do that. But also schools. In San Francisco, the schools have been so raucous that they actually introduced yoga in public schools. And I remember reading an interview with a fifth grader or fourth grader, and he was asked, what's yoga for you in school? Oh, he says, I come to school grumpy, and yoga makes me ungrumpy. I think that's a pretty good endorsement of yoga or some other form of meditation, that we're capable of being ungrumpy. Think about that. And there are ways to get there from here. And that's what meditation calms the reptilian brain. That's its real importance, because the reptilian brain is obviously out of control today. That's part of patriarchy. And how do we calm the reptilian brain so that the mammal brain, which is half as old, can emerge? And this is where compassion, kinship, and all that arises. Well, one way is meditation, because reptiles aren't good at bonding, but they're good at being alone in the sun. Solitude is a big deal for them. That's what a monk is. Monos, the word for monk, comes from the word for solitude. And so you tame your reptilian brain, nice crocodile, by meditating. Then your mammal brain can flourish, and it can connect with your intellectual brain, which is our most recent brain, and get something done in the world. So I think that's a big part of meditation, is calming the reptilian brain so the mammal brain, which is a compassionate brain, can flourish, can emerge from hiding, because the reptilian brain, twice as old as a mammal brain, wants to control everything. And that will not do. That's not gonna.
Absolutely. In your book, at the very end, the conclusion, you have a letter to the young seekers. As we close near the end of our interview, I would really like you to speak to the young seekers right now and convey your message to them.
Well, young people have a big challenge ahead of you. Obviously, this generation is not naive. It knows about climate change, even if their parents are trying to pretend it isn't important, or the media is trying to cover it up with other news. But so it's very important that the young people find their place in the universe and grow your heart. There's a wonderful indigenous teaching from Mesoamerica that says, to be human, you must make room in your heart for the universe. I just think that's a beautiful teaching, that our hearts are made for something big. Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, said every human being is capable of the universe, So there's such an invitation to grow our hearts and souls, and don't settle for petty ego trips or arrogance or clinging to our wounds, but rather grow your heart and soul. And there's so many ways to grow it. And science is a big asset today. For example, we've just sent up the Webb telescope. And very soon, it's going to be sending pictures back of the original light of the universe. I mean, that is so exciting. It's so special that our species, for all of our mistakes and imperfections, is capable of bringing to our living rooms, to our computers, the pictures of the original light of the universe. Remember, this is not the sun. The sun is only 5 billion years old. This is the beginning of the 13.8 billion year universe. So we all, especially the young, must refine our place in this blessed and sacred universe. Thomas Berry, one of the great eco-prophets of our time, and I'm honored to say he was a friend of mine and a teacher, he says we say, you will not save what you do not love, but we will neither save nor love what we do not consider as sacred, what we do not experience as sacred. And so our primary task today is to recover the sacredness of the earth, the sacredness of the universe that birthed the earth, the sacredness of the 13.8 billion year journey that had the imagination to bring us Homo sapiens forward. But we can't be naive. We have to realize that all our cousins, the Neanderthal, the Denizen, and now they've discovered 14 other cousins, hominids in Southeast Asia, 14 different groups, species, that are out of business. They're all out of business. We're the last ones standing. Now, doesn't that shake us up and say, wow, isn't that amazing? And isn't that important that we not yield to our own extinction and move beyond fatalistic self-hatred, the bullshit of patriarchy, and start learning what love is, beginning with yourself, as Eckhart says. And as Jesus said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Oh, there's permission to love yourself. You better believe it, because you're going to project your own self-awareness, your own freedom, your own beauty onto others and onto the rest of the world. So that inner work that you've been talking about is so important, Trey. And I really want to invite the young people into it. And, you know, your mystical experiences may be found in music, may be found in dance, it may be found in interacting with your younger siblings or something. It may be found in study, it may be found in science. It's everywhere. This invitation to get high on creation, on existence, on this earth. And, you know, it's just a pity to think that humanity would turn its back on its own future and its own destiny. It's going to be work. Prepare yourself for work. Gandhi said, he said, if you're going to be a leader, prepare yourself for mountains of suffering. Mountains of suffering. It's going to be work, but it's good work, and it's co-creating with the Holy Spirit, and the Spirit wants to work through you as an agent.
I love all of that. Matthew Fox, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with me tonight. How can people reach out to you? How can they find out more about you?
Well, I do daily meditations with MatthewFox.org every day, and it's free. You just dial into that address, or my webpage is MatthewFox.org, 2 T's in Matthew. So I think that would be, either of those avenues would be fine. And the new book is kind of a summary of my teaching. And I'm smiling in the picture here because I'm sitting in the choir stall of Meister Eckhart from the 14th century, this Dominican, the greatest mystic of the West, probably. And it's in Erfurt, Germany. And believe it or not, the entire Dominican church there and priory, which he was head of for 8 years, it was not in any way affected by war in all these years in Germany. It's like a miracle that's still standing. So I taught there for a week. I taught Eckhart in the very room where he taught novices in the 14th century. So wow. I'm sitting in his choir stall, and so that's why I have this shit-eating grit in my face. Why wouldn't I, you know?
Oh man. You have a long list of literature that you've contributed to this world, and I can't thank you enough for all the work and for all your sacrifices and for all the teachings that you've helped people understand, especially myself. So thank you so much, Mr. Fox.
Thank you. And thank your artist friend for that painting up there. It's really nice, and it's lively and colorful, and it's a good thing.